Twinge of fear and tears that glisten. There are spoilers here for those who listen. Welcome to Terror at Collinwood. 'Tis I, Penny Dreadful, and I am very excited to be joined by a plethora of podcasters tonight. Oh my goodness, it is the first annual Dark Shadows Podcast Summit. And I would like to welcome my guests this evening. This is going to be one for the ages, folks. You do not want to miss this episode because this is going to be a lot of fun. I am joined by, first, Between the Shadows, Christen Pierce and Cara Tillitz. Welcome.
Thank you.
Oh, and there he is. There he is. Better late than never.
Yes.
He's joining us. We have summoned him via Saynes.
Yes.
And he is coming. Come to us. Do you wish to speak?
I don't know. I don't know. I just, at this point, I just don't know. It's just horrible.
It's okay, because I haven't even gotten to you yet.
Oh.
I am about to, yeah. Joining us from resident of Collinwood is Jule T, Saynes, Patrick McCray, and Gordon Dymowski, and from Collinsport After Dark,
Wicked.
it's Alan James Gallant.
Yeah.
Welcome.
Yes.
I am so happy to have you all here for this Dark Shadows Podcast Summit. I think this is going to be a lot of fun. How is everyone doing? I'm just going to go around and ask how everybody's doing. I'm going to start with Alan because he just was George in Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf. So Alan, how are you doing? How did the show go?
Pleasantly exhausted now that it's done. I'm pleasantly exhausted during the production a little bit, but you kind of have to realize that you're climbing a mountain when you're doing a show that large. So
Yeah.
you're always kind of going to be a little tired doing it. But it was great. We had good audiences, good feedback. We had a talk back the last show. It was really good. And yeah, it was great. It was definitely one of those things you want to do in life as an actor.
And Cara and Christen, how are you both doing?
Doing great.
Very good.
Doing great.
Yeah.
Staying busy as always,
Staying
Yeah.
busy recording.
Yep.
Yeah, I love your new logo. Was that your husband who designed that logo?
Yes, he did. Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, can you plug him, because he's a very talented artist.
Barry McLean, the
Very
second
McLean Jr. Yeah.
Yeah.
He's a comic book. So
Comic book artist. Yeah. How are things?
good.
Doing great.
Doing very good.
We
Yeah.
just had a big episode with Ansel Farage in case anybody hadn't
cool.
seen it. And that was amazing. That was such a fun time.
I just recorded an episode with him recently too.
Yeah.
Love Ansel. He's, for those who have not seen his films, Ansel Farage does a lot of films with the Dark Shadows cast.
Oh, yeah.
And his new film is The Great Nick D, which is very fun. Jule, how about you? How's it going?
It's going great. How's it going with you?
Good. I saw you had an issue with your foot. Are you okay?
Yeah, my shoe was too tight and it rubbed against my foot, which I'm diabetic, but it's all but closed up. I go to my shoe appointment tomorrow, so.
Okay, well, good. I'm glad you're okay. And Patrick, you made
Hi.
it. You were having some technical issues, but you made it just in time. I'm thrilled.
Am I here? Can
You are
and
here. How are you?
the same as always, just a fit of internal angst and existential dread. So I've never been better. I'd be weirded out if it were anything else.
You have
no,
to have a driving force. That's a good one.
things are great.
Yeah.
Things are great.
And Gordon This is now everyone else here has been on the podcast before, but you
Mhm.
are a first timer, a Tara Collinwood virgin. So welcome to the
You know,
show.
that is the first time anyone has ever called me a virgin on Zoom. So thank you. I don't know whether I should be flattered or insulted.
I just recorded a podcast, a diecast movie podcast. We talked about the Rocky Horror Picture Show. So when you
Okay.
first time you ever go to Rocky Horror, you get the V on your forehead. So it was on my mind. Gordon, welcome to the show. How are you?
I'm good. You know, very glad to be here. Very glad to be with all of you, even you, Jule.
Uh-oh. I already see how this is gonna go. I already see how this is gonna
Oh, I say calor.
I've not met Gordon, but I have seen you quite a few times on Jules' podcast, and I love the
Mhm.
dynamic with the three of you guys. So today we're having a Dark Shadows podcast summit, and to celebrate, I don't tell Quentin, don't tell Roger, but I did sneak into Collinwood and I stole the brandy decanter
Girl.
from
My girl.
In Mrs. Johnson's locker, where it always winds
I
up.
know.
Why it
Mrs.
has
Johnson
the
has the
broad
best
base so it doesn't knock over when he reaches.
Oh,
to it.
okay. We've got the brandy, the brandy, but where are the frosted glass snifters so that we can crush
you
them in
crushed
anger?
right here. I'm not going to crush it in my hand though, because welcome everyone. And so I want to kick things off. We kind of preambled a little bit and talked a little bit about some of the different ideas we wanted to talk about and touch on. And Patrick had a really good suggestion, and I want to kick off with that. Before we get to that, I do want to mention that there is the Dark Shadows Remembrance event happening. That's going to be happening in Burbank. And just to make it clear, because we did talk a little bit about this too, a lot of people are confused about what this is. It's not a festival. Some people believe it is a sort of a convention experience. It's not that. It is actually the Friday night event is actually a memorial service. It is a celebration of life for Lara Parker and her family. I believe, the person who ran our fan club. I think a lot of the people that were close to Lara will be there, and they are going to show some clips and things like that. But it is a celebration of life. It is more of a memorial event. And then the Saturday event is a Jonathan Frid's centenary, which is a celebration of Jonathan Frid's. He would have been 100 years old, and several of the actors are going to be there, which is wonderful. David Selby, Catherine Lee Scott, Roger Davis, Jerry Lacey, Lisa Richards, James Storm, and remotely Marie Wallace, possibly even more guests. And they're going to be doing a lot of fun stuff. There's going to be a Q&A on Saturday. David Selby is going to be doing a performance pertaining to Jonathan Frid. So, and they're on the Friday, they're going to show some clips, I think, from Night of Dark Shadows, some of the lost footage from Night of Dark Shadows. I know Cara and Christen, you're going, right? Very cool. Anybody else going?
I'll be
Patrick,
there.
you're going?
I'm gonna be out there for about 3 weeks. Yeah.
You're going to be 3 weeks. Wow,
Yeah.
nice, very cool. I'm going. Anybody else going? No.
2 jobs call. And I guess
Yeah, it's tough. It's tough. With work and everything. I know it's tough to get out there, but it is really cool. I hope there is an actual convention experience for the 60th anniversary of Dark Shadows, because that's only 2 years away.
Right.
And I really hope that something will be done for that, because thankfully several of the actors are still with us, and it would be great to have something in 2 years from now. So I really hope there is an actual and if it's not a festival, something. If not, we got to make this happen, guys. This has to
2 years
happen.
away. Just 2 years to the 60th anniversary. That's amazing.
Isn't that crazy? Isn't that wild? Yeah. Patrick, you suggested a really good way to kind of ease our way into this, and that's to talk a little bit about our personal connections to Dark Shadows. And I know you've all several of you have been on the podcast and talked a little bit about that, but I do want to go around, and I want to start with Gordon because he hasn't been on the podcast before. So talk to us a little bit about your personal connection with Dark Shadows. How did you first discover the show, and how did you get into it?
Well, growing up, I was kind of a TV brat, and so I would read a lot of books about TV as well as watch TV. And I always heard, Dark Shadows with the soap opera with the vampire.
Mhm.
And when I was in college in the late 80s, there's an old school video store right on the bus route home. And one day I saw that they had the videotapes of Dark Shadows, and I had some memory of it because I think I was actually born during the show's run, so I think I might have caught something when I was really small in like syndication. So I started watching it. And it was one of those, $2 a tape, 3 for 5. So literally I just started watching it. And it started with episode 210, Introduction to Barnabas. And it became, I started getting, it was, I kind of in my own way ran home from school to watch it, but it was and then through that I got involved with the, Prodigy Online. There's a Dark Shadows group. And then the 1991 revival series came, and I was actually one of the people who protested outside of NBC when it was canceled.
Oh, cool.
Yeah, there were like cosplayers, and I don't think I got it quite right because I had two slogans. One was Barney is my buddy, and I don't think Barnabas would want to be called Barney. I just don't think that was appropriate. And the other was you can't kill something which is already dead.
Oh,
Now,
I love it. Yeah.
but then, I got involved in Prodigy. I actually had someone, and these were all your older, the ran home from school, but there's one other person who's kind of cool. He reached out and said, hi, you seem like a pretty cool person. I'm from Kentucky. I look kind of like Corey Feldman. And to this day, I would say I still wonder what happened to him, but he's right in this room. So, that's how Patrick and I met. So,
Oh, really? Oh, you knew
Yeah, so it
Patrick.
was over 30 years ago. Yeah.
You knew Patrick prior to Resident of Collinwood. Oh, I didn't realize
Yes.
that.
Oh,
I did
yeah.
not know that. Oh, interesting. Wow. So did Patrick bring you on board to recommend you to Jule for the show?
Yeah, it actually, and I also went to two of the celebrations. I went in 91 to 95.
Okay.
But it was actually 2 years ago. And at the time, and Patrick didn't know this, but my mom was, she was really sick and she had passed away in the middle of April. But it was
Oh,
like,
sorry.
I was going through a tough time. And I had actually, a friend of mine has a belly dance and fire spinning flow arts performance troupe. I bought a ticket, but I didn't want to go. And Patrick said, hey, yeah, I'm doing this podcast about Dark Shadows. Are you willing to come on? And so went there. I was on Jule's podcast, and we got that, and Patrick and I kind of restarted our friendship, and so it's been it's been great to reconnect with Patrick, and also occasionally appear on Jule's show, both with Patrick and alone. And right now if you excuse why I'm tentative, as we're talking about the Planet of the Apes movies, I started watching Battle of the Planet of the Apes, and that is one life decision I am seriously regretting right now. Patrick, you called it.
Everyone
Thank you.
starts it. It's like Space 1999. Everybody starts an episode.
Nobody finishes.
So, Patrick, you suggested this way to kind of get us going here, and we talked about how you first discovered Dark Shadows. So I want to ask everybody else, and starting with you, what is it about Dark Shadows that captivates you, that continues to captivate you?
It is the giving tree for me. It has appeared like a sentinel out of 2001, which is mixing a lot of different stories now. A number of times where I have needed it, where I've been particularly thoughtful. It showed up when I was a kid at a point when I really needed it.
Yeah.
And then it went away. It showed up when I was a teenager. A few years later, I was a different person and I needed it. And then when the DVDs came out, I was finally able to sort of get those. And they were great. And that just became symbolic of collecting and being able to finally have the whole thing, because I couldn't afford the videotapes when they came out. And then so it became a thing that hipsters didn't like at the time. So I had a thing to defend, which I love doing, and to stick up for. And that's really when I started to appreciate the little nuances of it. But I still sort of took it for granted until I saw the trailer. And then I went full on Widow Loman.
The trailer for the 2012 movie, I assume?
Yeah, the trailer. It's sort of like The Woman, but in a bad sense. But they're both involved in notorious crimes. and I went full on Widow Loman. Attention had to be paid.
Mm.
And so I did this crazy, viewing of it, this 45-day thing where I watched the whole thing 10 hours a day in 45 days. And I felt like it was just important. It was important as a fan to give something back. And I also thought it would cure me of Dark Shadows, be one fewer thing to be interested in, to spend money on. I move on with my life. I don't know if it was Stockholm Syndrome or what, but it had the opposite effect. And so it really galvanized me. I mean, it was my companion for 45 days, 10 hours a day. And I realize now, one of the cool things about that is that I picked, and I'm not making the haha here, I'm very serious. I picked a method of watching it that was as or more exhausting than it was to make it. And it really was a lot. I wasn't just watching TV. I was on a stationary bike. I was doing all this other stuff, writing, learning digital editing and art and so on and so forth. Met Wallace, et cetera, et cetera. And that was a source of identity that I wanted, because I still love directing, but I was also looking maybe for something in addition to that.
Yeah.
And it has been my companion, and it has been a source of great joy and thought for me, and it has opened up things for me that I never thought I would ever be able to do.
You won a Rondo Award, which is wonderful.
I participated in the winning of one Rondo Award, which was
Yes.
the Blog of the Year.
Yeah.
And then yes, I got Writer of the Year 2017.
Yeah, and you are nominated. Well, the voting is over at this point, but you are nominated for Dark Shadows Daybook Unbound.
Yes.
Congrats on that.
Thank you.
And I look forward to the next Dark Shadows Daybook, because I know you're working on more of those.
I wrote an essay for the first time. I wrote a
Aha.
daybook essay for the first time in like a year and a half.
Wonderful.
It just came out a little while ago. And yeah, the new book is coming along.
Fantastic. I'm glad to hear that. And Jule, how about you? What is it about Dark Shadows that still has meaning for you?
A show that in 2 years is going to be on its 60th anniversary still looks as new and fresh as it did when it started. And I do mean that. I think anytime I watch Dark Shadows and I go back, and I've been going back and watching the episodes to review them, it still looks as good as it did when I first watched it in the 90s. And it's a show that is truly timeless.
Yeah.
It really is. It's a show anybody could get into. It's a show that's easy to pick up. And really, today shows don't really compare to this. Because to me, when I fell in love with this show, I can't fall in love with the same way the shows today that I did, the way I did Dark Shadows. I just can't. There's, in every way, Dark Shadows is truly a masterpiece of ultimate fandom in every way. It's a show that has everything, literally. Romance, ghost, goblins, witches, a wraith, a zombie. I mean, it has time travel. It has parallel time. It has everything for everybody, and it has something for everybody. And I think it's just timeless. Sorry, ranted there, or went on there.
Oh,
No,
great.
that's great. I agree with you 100%. And I was just talking about that with Vikram Mather, who I had on the podcast, and we talked about why it still appeals to generations, second, third generation fans. And I think it is because it's timeless. It exists in its own sort of gothic otherworld. It doesn't reference Vietnam or, cultural upheavals that are going on at that time. And you could look at it metaphorically that it is looking at those things in some certain ways, but it's an escape. It's a pure escape, and it can still, no matter what your age is, you can still kind of go into that world and enjoy it. And I totally agree with you. And one thing you're doing that I really am excited about, and somebody else is doing it now too. They just started, but you're doing Dark Shadows one episode at a time from the start. And I wished you luck on an earlier episode. I'm like, that's going to take a while to get through 1,225 episodes. But you're already like in the 30s. You're already in the 30s with these.
I just did 37 today.
Nice.
And I'm doing my appointment's at 10 a.m. tomorrow, but I hope to, when I get back in plenty enough time, get 3 up by tomorrow.
Oh, wow. You're like a
I
machine.
hope.
I'm like, Jule, every 10 minutes, Jule has a new episode. I'm like, how? This is incredible. I mean, you're just like churning them out. But I do want to give a shout out to Raul Madblood of the Mad Bloods. That's his YouTube channel, and he for a while he was doing interviews with a lot of different horror hosts. Like he had me on his YouTube channel a while back, and he's doing something called Into the Dark Shadows, which every week he does an episode discussion with Poshy Baby and Raul Madblood. They do a discussion of Dark Shadows one episode at a time. So I will put a link to the Mad Bloods as well in the show notes. Raul is a good guy, so I'll put a link to that in the show notes. And I want to talk here to the Sisters of the Shadows, Cara and Christen. Cara and Christen. So Cara, we'll start with Cara and go to Christen. Like, what is it about Dark Shadows that still resonates with you today?
For me, and I'm talking about a really young age. I mean, from 5 years old and on, honestly, that's the first time we were really introduced to it. We're only a couple of years apart, a year and a half. So we're pretty close in age. And like at the age of 5, our dad introduced us to it. And from that age, I mean, it was my first taste of like the macabre and like all of magical and like seances and all that stuff. It just intrigued me from 5 years old. Like, and it was my first taste. And from there, and today it's still, like Jule was saying, it still resonates. There's nothing like it out there for me that touches me like Dark Shadows does. Like, it gives me everything I need. Like, I always go crawling back to it when I when I need something like that for me and for you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, yeah, I echo that. Absolutely. My earliest memory, Dark Shadows, was there on the living room TV, you know, whether it was, you
The
know,
big box one that's sitting on the floor. With
the one that's in
Yeah.
your grandma's house, and watching it on VHS, watching it on reruns, and just being scared to death at 5 and 6 and 7 years old, but can't stay away. You know, I can't stay away. And that just, when we were 15, that was our connection with our dad. That's what we did when we went over to be with him for the weekend or whatever. And we would always watch Dark Shadows. And I looked forward to those weekends. I was like, I cannot wait to get over there, because that was the only place we were seeing Dark Shadows, because our mom was absolutely not.
Oh, your mom wasn't into Dark Shadows? No.
Oh gosh,
no. She supports it fully, but she's like, I'm just not into that.
Right. but I, you know, I, like Patrick, as a fan of all these years, you know, 30 some odd years that we've been fans of this show, I, as a fan, wanted to give something back too. And anytime you got us in a room, that's all we talked about was Dark Shadows.
All we talked about.
Even before the podcast, I was like, you know what?
Let's turn the microphone.
Let's give this back. Yeah, let's give it come back, because we. But Dark Shadows is timeless. I echo all of that. And as a fan, I want to give something back. That's why we started this, you know. And it's just, I can't. I think I won't be sick of it till the day I die. It's a world where you can go and not have to worry about political or, you know, making someone angry or, you know, them referencing something that doesn't even matter anymore. It's suitable for all ages and for all ages, you know, for all of time. And I love it. I love it.
Wonderful. Great. I'm so excited that you've been doing new episodes lately. So I look forward to more of those coming up, because you're in the Adam creation of Adam and Eve. And
it was one of those things where we had to put our life together, and I think we have finally put our life together.
That's the great thing about Dark Shadows too, is you'll never run out of things to talk about. There's always something to talk about with Dark Shadows, for sure. And Alan, you're an original fan, you're a Run Home from School fan, and you're still just as gung-ho about Dark Shadows as you were on day one when you got into it in the 60s. And I absolutely love that you're doing Collinsport After Dark and examining all these really interesting you know, images from the show and citations from playing clips to illustrate things. Like, so talk about that. Why is Dark Shadows still, after all these years, still resonate with you and still connect with you?
It's how I fuel and encourage my OCD. I probably shouldn't, but I do. But no, like Patrick, I've experienced it several times in my life, different waves at different times in my life. But overall, there's been some thread of connection through it all. Well, when I was a child and probably too small to watch it, I was probably 6, I think, the first time I watched the show. It was in black and white. The show was actually going to color, but I wouldn't have known it for the first year and a half that I watched it, because I was watching it on an old Zenith 19-inch black and white portable television set, which is what we had. I go to my grandmother's house and I see it you know, it's in color. And it scares the hell out of me. It's so vivid. You know, it's one of those things. But seeing it in black and white really gave that impression of the universal monsters. Of course, we had horror hosts, Eddie Driscoll back
Eddie
in
Driscoll, yes, yeah.
and so we saw a lot of these black and white classic movies, and so it kind of gave the same feel of that. But as I kept watching it, and the time travel happened, and the costumes got more vivid, and so on, and the furnishings and the sets became more varied, I started to get really interested in that, and I became interested in history probably by 1968, 69, and that was about, you know, that was when they started doing a lot of time travel. So um, that was interesting to me, but probably most profoundly is my interest in performing arts, which I got initially through Dark Shadows. Other things came in later, but Dark Shadows was the thing that inspired me to write little plays and do little improvisational skits and using those characters. And we did that as kids, and that was what was happening for that. And after the show had gone off the air, the only thing I had left from the show were a few comic books and some of the paperbacks, and of course that's alternate universe stuff anyway. So I lost a sense of it a little bit for a while, but by the 80s syndication was happening, so I had a chance to watch a few episodes here and there, and got sort of grounded again back to what it was. And then in the late 80s, a friend of mine sold me a box full of stuff, and it had fanzines and a game and some of the addresses to write, because you're still doing that back then more than anything else. And then I started renting the videotapes and watching those, because we had a local video store. By the mid 90s, I was on VantageNet, the old VantageNet, which was one of the really good bulletin boards back then, around 95, 96, and was connecting with some other fans.
Well, did you join Alt TV Dark Shadows? I remember that
Oh yes,
group.
oh yes.
Yeah, I was in that too.
I kind of lurked for a long time, but I was part of that. Wow, that got really weird at one point. So
yes,
we
I think that was when I checked out.
But it kind of got weird for a while. But there was a lot of great stuff on it too. There was a lot of great people on it as well. But so then I'm start getting into collecting, you know, in the 90s, and I collect a whole bunch of stuff. And then I decided to go to back to college again, and finish my undergraduate and go to grad school. And I sold almost my entire collection to finance my first 7 or 8 months in Florida. And then probably about 7 or 8 years ago, I started collecting it again. And I started thinking about, through my terror of actually doing something about it, doing a podcast. So, and that didn't come to fruition until several years after I first thought of it. But, you know, watching everybody here participating in the podcast kind of made it a little bit more realistic approach for me. So it's been through the whole time in waves, you know, just kind of like this, down and up and down and up, but it's been up for most of the last, I would say, 30 years.
Yeah.
So.
And now that the show's over, I hope that the play, you know, I hope you come back and do some more episodes. Because I know our mutual friend Nick Caputo sent us both some very interesting photos. I am looking forward to that.
Okay.
Let's keep an eye out for that. I see the podcasts now as sort of the successors to the fanzines, like The World of Dark Shadows, Inside the Old House, Wincliffe Watch, Eagle Hill Sentinel, Shadows of the Night. There were so many great fanzines, The Parallel Times, Collinwood Revisited, Bruce Yarber used to do that one. I used to subscribe to all of those.
Eagle Hill Sentinel, Collinsport Call. They were a bunch of
so many great fanzines. Although we do have Daytime Gothic, which is Stuart Manning is doing, which is a wonderful zine as well. I almost hesitate to call it a zine because it looks more like a book than a zine, honestly. But the fanzines are, you know, we don't have them anymore. And I like that we're kind of keeping this rolling, because we have to keep the Dark Shadows fandom and the enthusiasm for it, I think, alive and well. And I want to talk about that a little bit later on. Jule suggested a really good topic I want to talk a little bit about show stuff, some of the plot line stuff. So if everybody's cool with that, I'm going to throw out some questions here. One was suggested by Jule, which I thought was a very good question. Jule asks, did Count Petofi survive the fire in 1897? If so, where is he? And is he in a different body? So I'm gonna Jule, since you suggested this question, I'm gonna kick it off to you. So what are your thoughts on that?
No pressure, right?
No pressure. You suggested it. You suggested it. So I want to
I
start
know.
with you.
I would say yes, he's in a different body. We learned one thing. We learned more than one thing about Petofi. One, he's a master of disguise. He sort of is like the Shadow in a degree. He has his own agents. We met Aristide. We met Charles Delaware Tate. And even without the hand, he had power. Then he gets his hand back and he has even more power. But the one thing we learned too was he hadn't had that hand in so long, he was having trouble controlling it at times.
Okay.
And I think by the end, when he's laying there and you got the war Garth Blackwood coming in to take care of business, and then they're gone. You see Petofi's glasses outside, Barnabas picks him up, they're just gone.
Mm-hmm.
And I think he figured out a way to finally just will himself forward in time, and he's probably not in the same body. I mean, it's a very intriguing character for sure.
Christen, what about you?
Well, the one rule we've learned about Dark Shadows is if you don't see a body, they're probably still alive.
Yep, nailed it.
Thank you for that. But I do believe he is alive, and I think he's probably in a different body. I mean, he was in an old body as it was, so he probably figured out a way via I Ching, via willing himself back. I mean, there's a million different ways we learned on this show to time travel, to travel forward, to travel back, to will yourself there the way that Barnabas did. So I think he's out there somewhere. Where? I don't know. Somewhere probably far away from the gypsies for sure.
Okay. Cara, what about you?
Well, like you think like somebody with Petofi as well. Like I kind of think of like the Angelique thing, or like the Quentin. Like, would he come back possessing somebody? Like I've thought about that. Like, but who?
Yeah.
No.
That's where my thoughts kind of stop. Where I get stuck. But that's kind of how I would think. Maybe he would come in first, like as a possession, maybe, and then work his way out. That's what I've always thought.
Okay. So starting as a possession, but then kind of reverting, going back into his body. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Gordon, what about you?
First, of course, he's alive. We didn't see a body, and excuse me. And of course, and the other thing is, Petofi, he's always one step ahead. So I think if he's alive, I think he's biding his time. But I think if he were to come back, I think he'd probably do something like take over Stokes, because one, they are David, and two, Petofi's main strategy is to get as close as he can to the Collins family, and that would be a great way to do it. And it would be a great kind of enemy within, traitor within, or then at some point things happen and Barnabas says something like, Stokes, you're acting very strange.
Mm-hmm.
And Stokes would say, what do you mean I'm Stokes? I am Petofi. There you go.
I love it. And that's a great way to still keep it Thayer David, which was my main gripe with the possession idea. But I like that it's still Thayer David, but it's he found a way to take over Professor Stokes. Professor Stokes is formidable, but so is Count Petofi is very formidable. So that's a very, very good angle there. I like that. Alan, what about you?
It's absolutely impossible that he would survive in anyone else's body. Yes, I think he actually did, but not mine, thank God. I think the idea is it was perfect daytime soap kind of trope, actually, although I know we don't like to refer to it as a soap, but it is that kind of a trope. Somebody disappears, it looks like a terminal event. Somebody's gone off a cliff, somebody did this, somebody did that, car accidents, whatever, but it wasn't really them, or in the case of Petofi, nobody, nothing. And, he staggered around for a while, got his prescription glasses back, and off he went.
Okay, so
I think we would have seen him again if the show had continued. I really
agree. Patrick, what about you?
You know, do you have a sense of wonder? Do you have a sense of love? Do you believe in everything that's wonderful and just and right in this world? Then Count Petofi is alive. He's like Catwoman in every sense. In every sense. He's ostensibly a villain, sort of, but like you in that second season of Picard where they finally got the Star Trek mythos right. They like that, like the great Catwoman. It's really impossible to see this person as a villain, no matter what horrible things they do. Yes, they have their elaborate traps and this and that, but he's so gosh darn lovable. And he just has this wonderful sense of life. Of course, he's not dead. Not only that, but I think he becomes a great friend and ally to Quentin and to the family. But of course, because he's technically a bad guy, he can work outside the lines even more than the rest of them. I suspect that the power of Tate, got passed on to someone else.
Okay.
And he shows up. Nicholas Blair's trying to run an art school to recapture that power. Petofi shows up to stop him. And we're off to the races.
Okay. So good. I think it unanimously, everyone agrees that Petofi survives in some capacity. And I think it's obvious. I mean, just looking at the fact that they chose, writing wise, to have the glasses outside the Charles Delaware Tate studio. Those glasses were not inside the studio when it burned down. They are outside. So Petofi made it outside. The glasses are there. Petofi survived. And I think they were certainly setting that up. I guarantee that if the show had continued through 1971 into 1972, we would have seen Count Petofi again, because he was too good a character not to bring back. He was just, and the writers loved writing Count Petofi. I mean, and Thayer David enjoyed playing Count Petofi, clearly. So he was a great villain, much like they brought back Nicholas Blair. I think they would have brought back Count Petofi. As to whether he would have been in his own body, that's a really good question. I'm partial to the idea that he would be in his own body just because I want to see Thayer David playing Count Petofi. I think he would. I like the idea of him starting out in someone else's body, and then gradually we would see him as the full-on Thayer David Count Petofi. I think that would be fantastic. And in fact, I have a nice picture back here that I was given by my friend Ivan for the video viewers of Count Petofi, and it says it's signed by Count Petofi. It says himself. It says, "Dear Penny, it's true. You are a real witch." Wow. Gosh, geez, it says, "Love always, Count Petofi." Thank you, Count Petofi.
Not since Angelique have I seen such a witch.
You know what Count Petofi calls it when he has to travel in someone else's body? He calls it flying coach.
There we go. There we go.
I do like the idea of him maybe being in Professor Stokes's body.
Yes, that's a really cool idea.
Because I think that Professor Stokes, for the most part, was untouched by anything evil. He was the medium to things evil too. So to see him just a little bit touched in that way, I think I kind of like to see that.
It is unsettling, because Professor Stokes is like the Van Helsing of Dark Shadows. He's the one who goes into the dream curse and confronts Angelique and says, "Hey, what's up?" So the fact that Professor Stokes would be overtaken by Count Petofi is unsettling, and I think that would have been a really cool angle. So good call there.
Especially if you set it up like a one-on-one between Petofi and Stokes, where they had the technology, they could do split screen
and they did in 1970 parallel time with Alexis and Angelique. They totally did that.
Right.
So
so it'd be like to have them as a battle of wills, and then it's like, Stokes wakes up and you think he's Stokes, but then you hear that weird kind of theremin where it's indicated that there's something wrong.
Oh, and bringing back that Count Petofi theme that they would always play with those the clarinets and oh man, I can just totally imagine it. It would have been perfect. Another storyline question I'm going to throw out: what happens? We talked about Count Petofi coming back. So what happens in a scenario where Dark Shadows continued beyond 1971, when I had Steve Turek and Jeff Owens on the podcast, the idea was floated that because the Gothic horror was falling out of favor as we went through the 70s, would Dark Shadows have had to adapt to that and change the type of material that they were presenting, or because I wouldn't have wanted them to. I would not have wanted them to let go of that Gothic aesthetic of the show. So what could they have done had the show continued? And I'll start with Alan.
I mean, we've got what happens in the 70s is you get the Californication of a lot of television, a lot of storytelling, because everything moves out of New York, everything moves into California. Well, most of things move into California. So I think it could still conceivably survive in its Gothic milieu, because it would be like the only thing for people that were still hungry for that sort of thing. So you might have had to adjust the stories a little bit, but the technology would keep improving, so there would be more things possible for them to do that wouldn't cost them necessarily a lot more money. So I really think, I mean, from everything that I've read too, I mean, aside from the early excuses for why the show went under, that the ratings were starting to come up again for some of it, and they could have gone with I mean, not my favorite storyline, but the 1841 PT was actually fairly healthy in terms of ratings, at least initially. But I just think that in order for the show to survive, it would have probably had to have been retooled on the production end, because obviously Dan Curtis wasn't interested in being hands-on with it day to day anymore. Costello had gone to Canada to do, Strange Paradise. And so there was going to be, in terms of that, there's probably going to be other signatures stamped onto the show.
Well, the whole Jonathan Frid and Dan Curtis thing was a problem as well, because
it was.
All of that happened with Night of Dark Shadows, and Curtis was mad and fired Jonathan. It was just the whole big to-do. So I would like to think that they would have resolved that had the show continued, because that's just insane to think that you would fire Jonathan, the star of your show. Like, I mean, you can't do that. I would imagine Dan Curtis would have come to his senses and been like, all right,
it was either that or you do what you do on soap operas, and you replace the character with somebody else, but
nobody would have accepted. You think anybody would have accepted somebody else playing Barnabas?
Can't accept it now.
Yeah, at that time?
Maybe not, but maybe not. But also maybe so. I mean, that's happened with other characters on other shows where
Barnabas, though, he's a pop culture icon.
I know. I agree. But the possibility is there, because it would have to be a brilliant casting job. That's all.
I think if there were a 71, 72 extension, and Fred leaving, they would probably think, you know what? This Selby kid can really carry it. Let's make him the focus, because he's a similar enough character to Barnabas in terms of they both have a touch of the supernatural. They've both done bad things, but they're trying to do better. With Barnabas, it's more noble. He's doing better because he's naturally a nice guy. Quentin isn't, but I think they probably would try to put him in more of a focus lead, and then kind of reshift the dynamics of the show, so that instead of Barnabas fighting whatever, it's Quentin fighting whatever.
And it's just a different kind of internal struggle.
Right.
The focus shifts to Quentin. Yeah.
They're doing that already with Quentin, like carrying the weight with Jonathan Frid.
With House of Dark Shadow. I think that, if the struggles didn't get resolved between Dan and Jonathan Frid, and making Quentin kind of the star of the show, they could have sent Barnabas back off into parallel time to find Roxanne, and that's where he would have stayed, and then, brought Quentin on as the star and redeemed Quentin in some kind of way, because Quentin was like a lot of us, and it was always, making dumb choices and thinking not with his brain. I'm trying to keep it G because of your, but trying to bring a redeeming quality to Quentin. If Jonathan was indeed not going to be on the show anymore, plenty they could have done with Quentin, you know, and
Yeah.
and sent Jonathan off into the sunset with somebody, or into the past, or into, you know, parallel time.
Right.
We kind of felt that way for a minute, you know, when Victoria left for the past forever, and we're like, how are we going to fill that void of Victoria Winters?
And they did.
But they did.
They
And it
did.
worked.
It's true.
And I think it would have worked as well if
Although they did try recasting her and it didn't with Betsy Durkin, and she did an admirable job in Carolyn Groves, but it just
I
didn't.
like Betsy Durkin, I gotta say, right?
Yeah.
You know, I
I'm
don't
a
mind Betsy
It
Durkin
was
so much.
okay. Yeah, she wasn't bad. I mean, I love Alexandra Moltke, but Betsy
Oh.
Durkin did an admirable job, I thought. Okay.
Yeah.
And Cara, what do you
Put
think?
up
How do
with
you
a
think it
lot
would have?
for
Do you have any thoughts on Cara and how it would have continued on?
Oh my gosh. I mean, honestly, I feel like everybody's kind of said it all.
Okay.
What I was thinking in my head, honestly.
Okay.
Yeah.
Jule, what about you? Any thoughts?
They could have did the Mummy.
Yeah.
They could have had Professor Stokes go to Egypt. That's something that they could have did. But to sort of widen your world of DS, to also try to bring it back to Petofi tries to bring an artifact back, but he keeps getting stopped. And the people who are protecting the mummy's tomb, so to speak, to prevent any real downfall, are the cat people.
Mhm.
Val Luton's cat people.
Oh, Val Luton, there you go. Yeah.
I think that's something, because you want to, yes, you want things to happen in Collinsport, but you also have to widen your world to bring it back to a degree.
Mhm.
You could, but also a person who could sort of go with him to get sort of suckered in to with is Quentin was a ladies' man. And one of them could be dancing with him, and they tell him, Mr. Collins, your world is about to get a lot bigger.
Uh-huh.
And
Yeah.
one of the woman he's danced with, you see her eyes glow yellow. They have no intention of letting Petofi out of Egypt with anything.
Yeah.
If they can help it.
And we already have a connection to Egypt through Quentin's adventures in Alexandria.
I was
Oh,
just gonna
totally.
say,
Yes.
Yeah.
The Mummy is one big one. And I was going to touch on that later when we talk about some of the authors that could have been used. But yeah, I mean,
And they
when the writers say they ran out of ideas, I think that's a cop out. I think they just were done with the show because there's so many Gothic tales that could have been introduced into the show to continue and woven into that world of Dark Shadows and reworked. And the Mummy is certainly one of them. The Cat People is a good one too. Or the Val Luton Cat People, I think, would have been an interesting choice to tie into the Mummy. And of course, like Alan said, there's already the Egypt connection. You could have brought back Laura, Diana Malay claims that they were going to bring back Laura, or claimed that they were. So, I mean, that makes sense too, to tie all of that in together for sure. And Patrick, do you think any thoughts on how Dark Shadows would have continued into the 70s?
I don't know how it would have continued. I think I know how it should have continued.
Mhm.
I think they would have moved to California. If they'd been smart, they would have gotten, one of the many writers of Star Trek, like David Gerald, Richard Matheson, somebody like that,
Mhm.
to take over as head writer. I think you would have seen Quentin with a mermaid.
Okay.
I think Quentin with a mermaid, it's a natural.
Well, it's a
but-
coastal town. They didn't do much with the aquatic sort of world, so I could see that. Yeah.
They didn't. And of course, we would have found out about how, Roger Collins was responsible for building the Seaview, which is what was really going on, with Admiral Nelson and all of that Voice of the Bottom of the Sea crossover. But beyond that, really, you had so much horror and weirdness in the 70s. No, it wouldn't have been quite Gothic. But I think you would have gotten some ancient astronaut stuff. You would have had Carolyn give birth to a devil baby.
Oh, for sure.
Yeah, you would have gotten some Satanism stuff going on. I think you would have gotten a lot of things like that. You can pretty much look at any of the horror trends of the 70s, which was a very horror-rich decade, and they would have found ways to incorporate whatever was active then.
Yeah,
I think.
I agree with you. I think for sure they would. That's the whole trend in satanic films with The Exorcist and The Omen and all. Rosemary's Baby was the 60s, but all of that vibe, I think, would have probably found its way into the show.
A trend that they would have been able to milk a lot, and I really mean this, is Nicholas Blair showing up, trying to create yet some new race for Satan
Mhm.
in some new form. So you would have
Yeah.
gotten, a race of robots around the time that you had
Interesting.
the
Yeah.
robots on, the fembots on $6 Million Man, and so on and so forth.
Oh,
And
okay.
Ancient Astronauts, Hans Holzer,
Mhm.
all of that.
Yeah, I was about to say, I'm sure, I think if the show had continued, they probably would have gotten like an intern or something to start looking at like other kind of pieces of literature and like, kind of low-hanging fruit. I mean,
Yeah.
You have some of the work of Charles Beaumont.
Talk about Charles Beaumont, who is very well known as a writer for the Twilight Zone.
Right.
Wrote some amazing episodes, wrote some great short stories that were adapted for the Twilight Zone, like The Howling Man, which was wonderful, and had John Carradine in that episode. He also wrote screenplays for the Corman Poe cycle, many like Mask of the Red Death and some of those. So talk about Charles Beaumont and how you feel his work would have worked in Dark Shadows.
Well, Beaumont is known as one of the big three of the Twilight Zone, along with Matheson Serling, and he has a really, his writing he has a little bit more of an edge than either Serling or Matheson. So, like one of the short stories that I think would be perfect for the Dark Shadows treatment would be In His Image, where it's a guy who walks into a town. He's like, "Oh yeah, I'm going to remember the old store. I remember the old," and everyone is like, "No, that never happened. I don't know you." And he does some digging, and he's got like, I think he has like a significant other, like a wife. They go and they find that he's actually an android created by somebody else who wanted to have he's like, the creator has all these evil impulses, and he's like, well, I have all these evil impulses, and I wanted to create a version of me that didn't have them. And in the background, there are all these like weird murder slayings happening. And so essentially what happens is they decide to switch places so that the robot takes the guy's life, and the guy's like, okay, and it turns out the killings are still happening, even though the guy actually leaves the town where the killings are happening. Another is called Elegy, where there are these astronauts that find they land on a planet, and it's like a perfect American town, but everyone is like embalmed, basically. It's a man who they transplanted this town, set up this colony, and he's like, well, I wanted to be sure everything was perfect, so I figured rather than wait until everybody died to embalm them, try to preserve life here. And he decides to, he wants to send the ship on its way so that they can be a perfect example. And I think you know where the story's going. And I think that kind of nice little macabre, the negative and macabre in these like idealistic, these wild ideas, like Printer's Devil. It's about a guy who, types out, his headlines are coming true, except in the original story, they are bizarre headlines, like, man gives birth to whale, or man picks up lottery ticket and wins $1 million. So they have to trick this devil into reversing all his spells, but they have to do it in a way that, because some people are benefiting, it's like, ooh, do we do that? And I think those kind of ideas could fit in Dark Shadows as well.
Yeah, there are moral conundrums in those stories too.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Ethical.
Well, the Howling Man, I think, is a good one too, because they already had the devil in Dark Shadows with Diabolos. Like, what if somebody figured out a way to trap, like Barnabas and Julia and Stokes figured out how to trap Diabolos, and somebody lets him out. He convinces somebody to let them out. Let him
poor
escape.
Willie, I can just see it now.
Or Will, yeah, it would have been Willie. It totally would have been Willie. Absolutely, 100%. And I wrote an article for the first Daytime Gothic, which was 10 Gothic tales that could have been used in Dark Shadows. And there are so many, like The Haunting of Hill House, I think would have been a good one by Shirley Jackson, and Phantom of the Opera you could have done. And of course, The Mummy, which I called out Sir Arthur Conan Doyle's lot number 249, which I think you could have done as a hybrid with the original 1932 Mummy with Boris Karloff, and done something with that. And that's one I'm surprised they never did. But I guess Dan Curtis was resistant to doing a Mummy in Dark Shadows for whatever reason. Or I remember reading an interview with him, and he said, "Oh, the Mummy's too slow. He would never catch anybody."
Yeah, but in the Mummy, he's not. I mean, he ends up becoming this
exactly
guy, and he's not wrapped up in the stuff anymore.
Totally, so yeah. One I thought of that I think would have been good was de Maupassant. He did one called The Horla, which they did as a movie with Vincent Price, and I think that would have been a good one for Quentin, because Quentin clearly in 1897, we saw he dabbled a lot in the occult. So what if something came back that he was, summoning at that time and came back in the present to pursue him and not leave him alone? I think you could have done the Horla. Another one I pulled was Samuel Taylor Coleridge, The Rime of the Ancient Mariner, where this ghost ship comes into town, and you could have done a coastal, Collinsport's a coastal town. You could have done the ghost ship thing and had this, sea captain or something that's trying to recruit Willie to join this ghostly crew. And then you could have had Willie as a prominent character, and Julia and Barnabas have to kind of help Willie, because Willie kind of goes into the background a bit, later on. And it would be nice to break, because John Carlin was so good. And it would have been great to have him at the forefront. And Julia and Barnabas, after Barnabas mistreated Willie so much early on. So, Barnabas has to do Willie a solid now and help him out. And I think that would have been an interesting way to work that in.
Something they could have did to sort of put their own spin on the creature from the Black Lagoon is have a sea creature maybe that was trapped under the ocean come loose because a ship's anchor catches whatever prison it was in underneath the water, and this sea creature, whoever it touches, it could take human form.
Okay.
And that's something they could have played with.
Yeah, and they could have tied that into H.P. Lovecraft with the Shadow over Innsmouth, with the sort of the fish people that worship Dagon. They could you could have totally tied in all of that, because they'd already done Lovecraft with Dunwich horror with the Leviathans.
I would have loved to have seen them take on the Hound of the Baskervilles, because even though it's a Sherlock Holmes, Holmes novel, there's a lot of Gothic in it, and I think you could you just remove, make it Quentin or Julia or Stokes and have a similar kind of mystery, except instead of a hound, it's, camera pans, you see two like glowing red dots, and you hear the familiar werewolf growl.
Oh, perfect. And you already Barnabas and Julia were already kind of doing this Holmes and Watson thing in 1840. I could have totally seen that continue on, and Hound of the Baskervilles would have been a really cool way to do that. There's so many great stories that
a lot of these sort of red herring spooky sort of detective stories that came out of an earlier era. Detective stories are great if you adapt them to the Gothic format, because obviously they were already establishing some of those in the show.
I mean, Edgar Allan Poe, who they used in Dark Shadows, created the detective story, Dupont. But I just want to circle back real quick, because you got somebody threw out the idea of recasting Barnabas. I think Alan had mentioned that. And there is a thought that was, I think it was Mary O'Leary suggested it, because I did the Halloween special I did with the horror hosts. I did all the horror hosts that celebrate Dark Shadows. And at the end, I used a clip from a horror host from Western Massachusetts. His name was Bob Macabre. That was his name, Bob Macabre. And I can't remember his real name off the top of my head. But he, I know it was Bob Macabre, but he auditioned for Dark Shadows, and it was toward the end of the series' run. And in the interview, if you listen to the end of that episode, they gave me permission to play the clip. And he claims that he auditioned for the role of Barnabas's brother toward the end of the run of Dark Shadows. Now, we know Barnabas didn't have a brother. He had a little sister, Sarah. He had an uncle, Jeremiah. So what is this? He's auditioning for Barnabas's brother? And Mary suggested that it was a way, they phrased it that way. The possibility was that they were planning to recast Jonathan Frid, and they listed it as Barnabas's brother. And he went in to audition for it, but Curtis was on the West Coast at that point, so he didn't get to audition. So if you go back, I can't remember the episode number. It was the Halloween Horror Host Dark Shadows tribute was the episode. And at the end of that episode, I played a clip of an interview with Bob Macabre, who's since passed away, but he talks about auditioning for Dark Shadows at the end of its run, and he was auditioning for the role of Barnabas's brother. So make of that what you will. Mary suggested they were possibly recasting Barnabas. So hey, maybe there's something to that.
And they probably were with that.
Yeah,
I would say so.
Yeah,
because nowadays, I just saw a video sort of similar to this, where they had this voice actor in a booth voicing different PC characters. Oh, we want you to do more characters, and instead of giving him a bunch of more characters, they gave the guy a main character. Vincent Valentine, Final Fantasy VII.
Okay.
I mean, that's something that happens now today, so I could see that happening.
I heard a story that I think James Storm said that he was actually, when he found out that the show was being canceled, he was coming in for a fitting for another storyline. And
Yes, I heard that story as well. And I hope to have James Storm on the podcast at some point. I've been talking to James and Valerie.
That's an interesting guy from the perspective of actors, because he had a connection to Jonathan Frid going back to San Diego.
Yeah, and
I think he
Shakespeare.
saw him play like Caliban.
Caliban. It was Caliban. Yes, you're right. Second half of the episode now. I want to talk a little bit about some of these other ideas that are outside the show itself, but maybe related to it, to the fandom and to other things. First question I want to toss out here. And I was talking to a good friend of mine. He's been on the podcast before. I may bring him back on to talk about this if he's willing to. Everybody is very gung-ho about the idea of a new Dark Shadows, of a sequel series to Dark Shadows. Not so much a reboot of Dark Shadows. Been there, done that. We've seen the reboots already. Now it's sequel series is the big thing. Mark B. Perry's working on this new show, which I hope to see. But there is a counterpoint to this. And I've read an article where somebody took an opposing position, and my dear friend of mine, who I respect very much, took an oppositional position to a new Dark Shadows and thinks it's a bad time to do a new Dark Shadows, and pointed out a lot of reboots and remakes or new things that have come out that are not necessarily what the fans of the classic stuff want to see. And I see his point, because I remember when I had Mark on the podcast, he talked about how when he was with the CW was pushing to make Blue Whale like a retro hipster bar, and they had their own ideas. And the Suits wanted to push their ideas into the show, and stuff I didn't like, that I wouldn't have wanted to see. And this begs the question, should Dark Shadows remain as it is? Like, we have our classic show and don't touch it. Now, I love the idea of a new Dark Shadows for many reasons, one of which is it'll bring more attention to the original Dark Shadows. I like the idea of perpetuating the Dark Shadows. But is a new Dark Shadows really what we want to see? I'm going to kick it off with Patrick, and I'm going to go around.
Yes.
Okay.
We certainly want more Dark Shadows. And I would not have said that before the premiere of Strange New Worlds.
Okay.
And Strange New Worlds, when I got done watching the pilot to that, I thought, was that so tough? Was that so difficult? And was it because I don't really know why it has been so difficult. I think part of the problem is in trying to overthink the franchise, and we can't give people what they want because that's fan service, it's pandering. They have all of these titles and all these terms that they can put on it. But the fact is that the core idea still works, or we wouldn't be watching it. So how do you give people that core idea with a little bit of extra quality, with integrity, with intelligence and wit, so that they feel like they've gotten Dark Shadows? They only have 1,225 examples to follow. And if you give people Dark Shadows, it doesn't mean you're pandering. It doesn't mean you're just serving up the same thing again and again, because we are new people. We are the next generation. We don't need to see a next generation. We are the next generation making it. But nevertheless, like the people making Strange New Worlds right now, which I think is a masterpiece, I think it's captured Star Trek better than anything since City on the Edge of Forever. And that, to me, is a prime model of how and why these things still work. And if you just give them some Barnabas, give them some Julia, give them some thrills, put them in danger, give them some heartbreak, and do it with elan, it is always time for that. It's always time for good storytelling. Yeah. It's always time for entertainment. And as I said before, if it weren't, we wouldn't be watching it or talking about it now.
Okay. And I have no question that Mark, for example, Mark B. Perry, I have full faith in he's true blue fan. I mean, he knows Dark Shadows. He loves Dark Shadows.
He also knows television production better than 99%.
Oh, for sure. I'm more concerned, I think, about whatever platform it's on, trying to put in their own 2 cents and putting their spin on it and putting, what they think their demographic is going to want. And that's more my concern. Now, you mentioned Patrick, Barnabas, and Julia. So you're saying recast Barnabas and Julia, new Barnabas and Julia.
Of course.
Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, why can't you have an Anson Mount to Jonathan Frid's Jeffrey Hunter? I mean, how many Sherlock Holmes have we had? How many Doctor Who's have we had? How
Totally.
many James Bonds and Tarzans
Spock.
have we had?
Yeah.
How many Spocks have we had?
Yeah. Cara, what about you? What do you think?
I mean, not to repeat Patrick, but on a level of what he was saying, that classicness of Dark Shadows doesn't have to change.
Mhm.
Like, I feel it doesn't have to change. I feel like there is just a bit of that it does need to be, you know, kind of today, like in modern times, you know, like as far
Mhm.
as like the decade we're in, like when we remake it, I feel like it does demand to be modern in that sense, like
Mhm.
being today, like it would feel weird, you know, with Dark Shadows with cell phones or like the internet. It would feel weird,
Right.
but there is a way you could do it to keep, you know, a classic feel. And I feel like that would make it even more exciting if we did time travel
Yeah.
in a Dark Shadows
Well-
today. Like it would just make it a little that much more.
Mhm.
I don't know the word I'm looking for, but
Yeah.
Yeah.
Removed. You know, I
yeah,
Cara, there is one thing I like about the 2004 pilot, and it's that there's no cell service in Collinsport. Doesn't
Yeah.
work.
Yeah.
And there are I mean, I was just in Vermont, in rural Vermont recently to go see the eclipse. No cell service where I was. There are places where there are no cell service. Collinsport would 100%
Yeah.
be one of those places. You can't use your cell phone in Collinsport. Sorry.
yeah.
Christen, thoughts?
Oh man, I'm a little bit on the fence because
Mhm.
my diehard bleeding heart wants to see Dark Shadows brought into the modern world. Like
Mhm.
I want to see it. I want to see Barnabas Collins and I want to see Roger and Elizabeth and I want to see them all in the modern world and see a brand new Dark Shadows but I want to see it like Dan Curtis envisioned it, you know,
Yeah.
because I know there's so much he wanted to do that he couldn't because of budget, because of what time it was on during the day. And we did get a little bit of that with the revival in 1990. But at the same time, I kind of want to see where Carolyn has gone. You know, now
Yeah.
maybe she's an old lady now, you know, and maybe I don't know. I'm very on the fence. Like I want new Dark Shadows, which is what I was hoping for. God help me with the Tim Burton film, but which we really didn't get because there was so many 2 cents put in, you know, the crassness and the humor that really wasn't Dark Shadows. That's what it made it feel so not Dark Shadows in name only, maybe. You know, I want something that is gonna hold true to the original, but also bring it into the modern world. You know, no cell phone service. You know,
Yeah.
Vicky was a blonde in the 2004 pilot. You know, I'm cool with that. You know, but just something that you know is still true to the original.
And one more
You know,
thing I wanted to add, I would today I would love to see David as the man of the house.
Yeah.
Like
Yeah,
the
I would love to
heir
see
Collinwood.
that.
I would love to see him all grown up as a man, kind of like with Dr. Sleep.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah,
like,
yeah. And they
I
did
would
that
love
at
to
the
see
Big
that.
Finish too with Alec Newman, who played Barnabas in the
Mhm.
2004 pilot. He plays David, grown up David in the Big Finish.
Could I please just throw one thing in?
Yeah, go for it.
You know, something that occurred to me when I was doing the watch through, the 45-day watch through, is that Dark Shadows is built to be remade. Because what is Dark Shadows but a series of contemporary remakes of much older stories?
Yeah.
So, you know, what is the Adam story but Frankenstein with a tape recorder?
Yeah.
Mhm.
Think of how crucial that is as a storytelling tool. So perhaps the cell phone is the modern day tape recorder. I mean, good God, look how they've handled it in Sherlock.
Mhm.
You never would have thought any of the stuff in Sherlock would have worked.
It was great.
And it's perfect.
Yeah.
So Dark Shadows is built for that.
Yeah.
Okay,
You're
good
absolutely right.
Good comment there.
Absolutely right.
All right. Jule.
Yes, new Dark Shadows. Hell to the yes, new Dark Shadows. And please don't edit that out.
I won't.
I respect and appreciate everybody's opinion. A friend of mine, Mark Gilman, who was on Twitter, when I first opened my channel and stuff, I said, is there any new Dark Shadows out there? And he said, not on television, not canon-wise. He said, but there's this blog. And I said, okay. And he sent me it. And he said, now he explained to me, he said, I want you to let you know, the person writing this was writing it as a sequel to the original. And it was Return of Dark Shadows by John Philip Betancourt.
Mhm.
And I read it, and I'm thinking at first, was I going to like this? And yes, I liked it. Mark B. Perry is doing a sequel to the original, which canon-wise hasn't been done.
Yeah.
I think me personally, and I'll only speak for myself, I don't compare any of the movies, whether it's House, Night, or the 2012 movie, to the series because they're not canon to it. It's the same thing with the 1991 revival isn't canon to the original series. It's its own thing.
Yep.
The '04 Unearthed pilot is what it is. It's an unearthed pilot. I get why people are untrustworthy of a studio because we've seen studios just make the poorest decisions on God's green earth. And they have. But I think who I have a lot of faith in is Mark B. Perry. And my suggestion to the studio would be, and not that they'll listen to me, give Mark B. Perry full control in decision making.
Yeah.
It's that some if you feel that you can't trust the heads of your table to run Dark Shadows, we'll give the writer full creativity. So that's my suggestion.
Okay. Alan, what about you? New Dark Shadows or leave it alone?
Yeah. Oh, no, don't leave it alone. There's no need to leave it alone because what we already have, the original series, stands by itself. Nothing can be done to it by adding on even things we don't like about Dark Shadows because it's always going to be there. So throw stuff against the wall and see what sticks. And that has to do with, we're coming back into an era where episodic television in all of its forms is now also continuing television. The story continues in arcs beyond 1 episode, 2 episodes, sometimes 50 episodes. So some of the best series that we've had over the last 10 years have done this. They've been an ongoing story. So they're no longer self-contained like, the $6 Million Man or whatever, where you have an adventure in an episode and then you move on to the next episode. So that tendency plays into one of the difficulties about Dark Shadows, which is it's a continuing story. It's that kind of a story that's the format that works so well with it. That's the format that established fans of the original series have come to know and love. That's the format now that new fans can say, oh, that's familiar.
Yeah.
That's not something that's weird and new to us. And also the Gothic thing is not weird and new to new audiences at this point in time either. It's become incredibly popular. There's been several Gothic arc stories. Of course, we've got American Horror Story, which has some of those elements in it. You've had Penny Dreadful, your namesake.
You got Wednesday.
And
Guillermo del Toro's films are
absolutely.
He gets it. He has that sort of Gothic aesthetic in a lot of his films.
Yeah, well, he has that visual Gothic aesthetic as well.
Yeah.
Intense. It's really good. But also, I think that there's, I think for some of the fans of my age, particularly and older, some of the original fans, we get hung up sometimes in the faces that are assigned to the characters in our mind. Rather than the characters, which go out. Even Jonathan Frid would say, hey, I wasn't the only person to ever play Caliban. I just gave it my tag. I just did it my way. So, I think there needs to be flexibility with that with established fans too, as well as the fact, I think a lot of established fans are coming around now to the idea we need to move on from the reboot type situation into the continuation of the story, or the we're going to go in this direction now or this direction now with some connection to the original story and obviously the family and the house and several of the touchstone things that can appeal to everybody, not just people that are really super familiar with the show.
Gordon?
I'm really tempted to say, give a third option, like let's just wipe all the tapes and forget about it. But I think it's time for a new Dark Shadows. It's one of the few franchises, and I hate that word, that's been revived. And I think if you're going to do it, I think you've got an audience that is primed for, for genre storytelling. For new Dark Shadows to work, I think what you need is a Patrick McCray-esque understanding of the mechanics of the storytelling and the lore of the show, with a really unique idea as to how you make Dark Shadows work in current times. I mean, you need like a Russell T Davies with Doctor Who in 2005, or Rob Doherty with Elementary in 2013. It's Okay, how do we take these, everyone's done a Sherlock Holmes show. We all know what Doctor Who is. How do we make it a unique piece of drama? How do we translate it into 21st century? What I don't want to see is, I don't want to see like, okay, it's another train shot with another My Name is Victoria winners.
Right.
We've been there, we've done that. I think you've got a really unique opportunity to do season-long arcs, Hey, you want to do some fan service? Year 2, you do the 1972 flashback with people portraying versions of the original cast.
Yeah.
You go look at the works of like Robert R. McCammon, or now the public domain has a ton of stuff. Maybe you throw in a gratuitous reference to Safety Last with like Professor Stokes hanging off a clock. But I think you can revive it. I think a lot of it is just not just the movie. I think Tim Burton needs to be reminded that he messed this up seriously. I also think you really need to have a sense of, this is a show that is about people who are just, people who are trying to not only assert their humanity, but reclaim it as well.
Yeah. Yes.
And I think there's something very universal and primal in that. And I would say Dark Shadows is one of those where it is rife, because we know we have, only a little over 1,000 episodes. And there's potential in that, and things where you can take apart and add to. So I'd say, I'm all for new Dark Shadows, and not just, let's just leave it be.
Patrick called out Brave New World, but it was also The Mandalorian, which I think was kind of, a lot of Star Wars fans who are notoriously can be very vitriolic at times, that they, I think mostly unanimously, especially the first, season or two, were very on board with The Mandalorian, because it genuinely felt like Star Wars. It captured that spirit. And
They got it.
They got it.
They got
Yeah,
it.
they nailed
Yeah.
it. They got the feel, and you got to do that. You can't be afraid to embrace the gothic feel of Dark Shadows, and also the fact that it's gothic, but it undermines the gothic in a lot of ways too, because it takes those monstrous characters and makes them the protagonists of the show. But it's eerie and mysterious in it. And like Patrick said, you're adapting all of these previously existing classic tales and bringing them into the mix. And I think you can continue that and keep that in the DNA of Dark Shadows. You kind of have to. Worst case scenario is something we don't like. I don't think it's going to tarnish the original show. The original show is going to stand on its own. But ideally, it'll be something that we want to see. I'm going to put this question forward, because this was one of the ones that came up when we were doing our little kibitzing before we talked. The idea of gatekeeping in the fandom, and just fandoms in general. And this is a very positive keep this podcast very positive. So, but I do want to touch on this, because it isn't an issue that I've seen happen in other fandoms. And gatekeeping, just for those don't know, gatekeeping in fandom is the act of trying to control fan activities, limit access to certain information, or define who is or isn't a real fan of a certain thing. There's sort of entitlement issues. Like I said, most Dark Shadows fans are wonderful that I've met. But Gordon, you've encountered some of this in the Doctor Who fandom. So could you talk a little bit about gatekeeping in fandom, and maybe concerns with regard to the Dark Shadows fandom?
Well, sure. When I'm not on podcasts with Jule and Patrick talking about Dark Shadows, I run a Doctor Who meetup. Mm-hmm. And I started running it around 2010, when, it was starting to get popular because of David Tennant and Matt Smith. And there were a lot of, and I'm part of the generation, I'm part of the first wave of American fans. So as Dark Shadows fans ran home from school to watch it, we stayed up late on Sunday nights to watch it on Doctor Who on PBS. And it was a lot of, they need to watch the original show in order, the new stuff isn't real Doctor Who. They need to watch the original show. They don't understand a thing. It's too, the show doesn't do what real Doctor Who does, blah, blah, blah. And what I kind of had to learn, I had to develop a couple of healthier habits. The first is to reiterate that the only requirement for membership in a Doctor Who meetup is you like Doctor Who. Mm-hmm. Doesn't matter who you know. secondly, I always tried to be welcoming and make the environment, yeah, I know it's the pejorative is safe space, but you make it comfortable for people to come in to just enjoy the show. When I've had people act out, and I've had it done at, conventions where people say, oh, well, my buddy watched on the internet that blah, blah, blah. I usually, look, we're all here. We all like Doctor Who. We all have our opinions. Please respect that some of us don't necessarily like it. I mean, sometimes I've had to be as dark as to say, you know what, if you don't like it, there's the door. You're more than welcome. You might want to check out another meetup because we're probably not it for you. But I think with gatekeeping, I always try to remember internally that none of us here own Dark Shadows. We don't,
Yes.
none of us, I don't think any of us have the last name of Curtis. None of us are related to, we don't own that. Nobody in Dark Shadows fandom owns it. We own our feelings. We own our experiences. We own our kind of interpretation of the material. And that part of the joy of fandom is that fandom is something that is best enjoyed and that shines brightest when it's shared. I mean, we all have our own individual perspectives on what the show means to us. And I think gatekeeping, when we, I think part of preventing it is one, calling it out on a subtle level and saying, look, that's not cool. For those who are watching and saying, well, oh, they're not true Dark Shadows fans, it's not a chip. We don't own Dark Shadows and neither do you. And reminding that, the more we welcome, we want new fans in. When I was a Doctor Who fan as a teenager, I wanted more women to watch it, because I was hoping to get a date. I was a lonely kid. I wanted more people to like it so I could talk to people. I got my wish. I'm happy. And I think that's the way to approach Dark Shadows fandom. Is we want more people. We've got a pretty big tent. We want as many people who would like the show to come in. And I think having that approach is optimal.
Excellent.
But I may be wrong.
No, I think that's a great perspective. Absolutely. Alan, what about you? What do you think?
I remember there were a lot of imbroglios, especially back in 2012, as you well know as well.
Yes.
In terms of Dark Shadows. But I mean, yes, I have run into it in other fandoms as well. But in particular, there would be certain people, I think, that decided that it was an identity issue for them. And this weren't, again, as you say, it's not a lot of people. And it just sometimes, unfortunately, becomes an identity issue for people. And they identify with being a gatekeeper, that they're supposed to hold this close rather than open their hands and say, here you go. My answer to that is I just introduced the show a few months ago to a 16-year-old high schooler who just said, oh, I love Universal horror movies. I love this. I love that. And I said, try this out. It's on Tubi. It's completely free. You can look at it on your laptop. Don't do it in class, but you can look at it on your laptop. And this is my thing about it. Yeah, I got embroiled in a few back in the day, a few debates, we should say, where certain people would shoot out all in caps what their opinion was about, that they disagreed with. Not nice stuff, but my argument was always, it's okay. It's okay if somebody else doesn't agree with you on this. The idea is to share the show. Is the idea, in whatever way you want to. And not shut down anything as long as it can be translated into something positive. Don't shut it down. You can be you, I can be me, and we can be together on certain things and maybe not on other things. It's perfectly fine. It's like life that way, only it gets a little more concentrated, I think, and it gets a little more, there's a sheltering around it that makes people, and of course the internet, people feel free to express strong opinions.
For sure. Yeah. Okay. Cara, any thoughts on gatekeeping? Have you encountered any of that at all?
I mean, truly so far, like Gordon and Alan have really said it. But I mean, it's easy to feel like you know it all. Like when you're a huge fan, it's easy to feel like you know it all and feel like a gatekeeper, like you could be. But that's also the beauty in everybody's opinion, is that we can all come together on that. That's the point of everybody having their opinions and not nobody being a gatekeeper about it. Like, we want to hear people's ideas or thoughts or what they know that we may not know. That's the beauty in it of it all. And that's my opinion. I mean,
Yeah, I agree with you. Yeah. Kirsten, what about you? Any thoughts?
I haven't really encountered it so much myself. However, I've seen it third hand, second hand or whatever. But me being a mom of teenagers, and Dark Shadows has been there for my kids all of their lives too. So I'm hoping to raise up a new generation of Dark Shadows fans. And I certainly wouldn't want people to think that they're not true fans because, their mom is a second gen or whatever. And, they would be third gens. But I think you're absolutely right. Coming together like this is awesome. Like the idea of this, sharing all of our opinions and something that we're so passionate about. I don't see how that can be wrong, to be fans of Dark Shadows and just talk about it. It's how we keep it alive. And if we're keeping it alive and sharing our opinions, and this is great, this probably wouldn't work. Oh, well, someone disagrees. Great. What do you think about that? That is keeping this alive. And I think that is our goal, as podcasters, as fans of Dark Shadows, we're, talking about it, disagreeing, friendly disagreements, agreements, we're keeping it alive. And I think that's the most important thing of all. Yeah.
Excellent. What a great way to phrase that. Yeah. Jule, what about you?
Secretly, when this podcast is over, we're all going to go bite each other's ankles. No.
It.
No.
Gordon, can you control him?
I don't know, with that foot thing going on.
I think ankles is something else.
Jule, you're out in public.
I know.
You're amongst you're other people involved. Jule.
I
would suggest
I apologize. No, I think that
we're all friends here.
Look, we've all been on each other's podcasts. We all don't always agree, but we don't sit here and yell at each other about it either. If you feel that you honestly don't want a new Dark Shadows, no one's against you.
Don't watch it.
Yeah, we all enjoy watching the original Dark Shadows. At the same time, we want something more current, and to sort of put it in perspective. Okay, I'm a fan of the Shadow. Tell me how, though I like the Shadow and it has a fan base, the Shadow really isn't in a large existence either, the way it used to be. So if you keep gatekeeping, perhaps Dark Shadows won't be. And be careful of that. Is all I'll say.
Good point there. Yeah. I mean, how many of the original fans of the Shadow are still with us,
Yeah.
Well, that's
my dad's 96, so there's one.
Oh, awesome. Good.
I will say that part of my extracurriculars, I'm also a new pulp writer, and every year I go to Windy. If you ever want to meet fans of old pulp, Windy City Pulp and Paper. It's like the first weekend of April. And there's actually a gentleman named Martin Grams who actually wrote a nice thick book about the Shadow.
Oh,
the Radio Shadow. He also wrote about the Lone Ranger, the Green Hornet. And if you must buy a book with the Shadow, it's Martin Grams, not James Peterson. Just a reminder. You'll thank me later.
Yes,
okay.
Yes,
good.
You will.
All right. And Patrick, what are your thoughts on gatekeeping? I know you've encountered some of that over the years, and do you have any thoughts on that? And
sure.
Sort of feelings?
Yeah. When a religion goes bad, it's not about the religion. It's about people who have some kind of self-esteem issue and some control issue and something like that, and they use the religion as an excuse. And when you look at some kind of, ancient dogma that must not be questioned and must be presented in this very, very, very tiny box, you are looking at something that I think is inherently stultifying and has nothing to do with Dark Shadows. I think it's incumbent on fans to keep a growth mindset and to recognize when someone's issue and someone's behavior has nothing to do with you, because it doesn't, has nothing to do with Dark Shadows, because it doesn't. It has something to do with the fact that there is something profoundly missing in their lives that they are trying to control, and that Dark Shadows is in some cases, very few very few, and you get this in any fandom. We be talking about Star Trek, we be talking about anything. Is the way in which it happens. Now the fact that Dark Shadows does deal with loneliness and deals with isolation and things like that, and alienation, I think may bring a little bit more out.
Yeah.
But nevertheless, I think that that the impetus is on us to maintain a healthy dialogue of friendliness, open-mindedness, and just general kindness. It's like Jakar says, above all, be kind. And if you keep that as your watchword, you're going to be fine.
That should be the catchphrase for all fan communities. Be kind.
Kind.
I wish
we're
everyone.
already alienated. We're already fans because we face enough sort of oppression and rejection from the outside world. Good God, we don't have to do it to each other. That's the last place we need it from.
It's ironic because the other making the other is kind of what happens sometimes.
Mhm.
Yeah.
People are people, and there's an irony to that. It's a sad irony, but yeah, you're right. We need not do that to ourselves.
Agreed.
For sure.
Go to Cork's Bar, get a root beer, and watch Dark Shadows.
Yeah, that's it. And I find
Cheers, I'm
when you
empty.
get together in person with Dark Shadows fans and you're all watching Dark Shadows together or talking about it, it's a whole different animal than what you're dealing with the internet. Because the internet, people are emboldened, and it's that sort of keyboard warriors thing. And
Board courage.
yeah, I've never had any issues in person. I worry about Dark Shadows falling off the pop culture map, and some would argue that it has. What can we do to keep Dark Shadows in the zeitgeist?
Well, what I think what a lot of we can do is when we're talking to people, not just hype up the show, but talk about why it's a lot like other shows people like with the Doctor Who meetup. Recently I held a virtual session called, well, if you like Doctor Who, you'll like. And I talked about how Dark Shadows is very much, in terms of television production, in terms of thematically, a lot of it is reminiscent of the Philip Hinchcliffe, Robert Holmes run on Doctor Who, which is like Tom Baker's first 3 years, where a lot of adoption of classic stories, the visual look is similar. So it's encouraging that idea that this is worth checking out. It's also free on Tubi and other kind of streaming services. So it's not like you're giving a lot of time. And the great thing is, because it's a soap opera, you can watch, and it's only a half hour, you can watch like 2 or 3 episodes at a time. It's probably much easier to watch and more enjoyable to watch something like Dark Shadows and say the Rat Patrol, which is about 4 guys in jeeps blowing stuff up in the desert and fighting Nazis. But it's encouraging that, if you really like this kind of thing, this is worth checking out. There's very little risk to checking it out. Because it was made at an earlier time in a time slot where you had to be very strict about what you did in terms of, blood and kind of adult themes. It's something that is easy for people above, say, I'd say maybe 10 years old, because that seems to be like the lowest age. But it's finding what they like and saying, here's the thing. Dark Shadows is a thing that can fulfill your knot. It's also a great way to learn about like different kinds of storytelling, production. My favorite thing about Dark Shadows is when they do like the weird kind of surreal, like the Dream Curse, the Shadows of the in 1897, some of the musical stuff. So it's letting them know that, like, look, it's okay to watch this. Watch it for a couple episodes. If you don't like it, no, you can move on. But it's making it clear that this is something that's worth checking out.
Jule.
A friend of mine is in the 700s of Dark Shadows.
Nice.
But I will say,
Good place to be.
every time I go out with my wife, which I went out today with her, I say to somebody, you know what show you should watch? You should watch Dark Shadows on TV. And I said it has a vampire, a witch. And I'm like, oh, you know what? I've seen the Universal classic monster movies. I like this. I said that you'll love this. And I do that every time, and my wife just shakes her head and says, please stop, which I don't listen. I think that's the best thing you can do, is just go up to complete strangers and tell, hey, have you ever seen Dark Shadows?
Yeah.
And say, hey, it's free on Tubi. But I do think that another thing Dark Shadows could do, or the Cara sisters could do, make a Dark Shadows video game would be huge.
That's something that I think would be good too. I think that's would be a good way to get younger people into finding out what Dark Shadows is about. I agree. Yeah. Cara, what do you think about keeping Dark Shadows going? I mean, we do podcasts and stuff, but what else can fans do to keep Dark Shadows alive?
Kind of just a little bit, Joel, what you just said. Like, you know, you never pass up the opportunity to introduce it to somebody. Like when you know, if you feel like the opportunity is right, the time is right, it's presenting itself. I never pass up an opportunity to introduce somebody to it, to suggest it to them, and to keep it short and sweet. We said it earlier, just keep it positive. Just keep it positive. Like with the gatekeeping, just keep the talk positive. And I think that will go such a long way. Yeah.
Excellent.
You know,
Christen?
I told this story on our very last episode with Ansel, you know, the introduction part of it. But when we started this podcast 3 years ago, it was because a friend of mine had sort of a dark podcast, you know, talking about witches and werewolves and all sort of ghost stories and stuff. And he asked me to come on the show and talk about whatever I want to talk about. And I said, well, keeping on your topic, I said, I would love to come on and talk about Dark Shadows. And this fool had the nerve to ask me what was Dark Shadows. So I'm like, okay.
It's also an opportunity.
It was an opportunity. And I think just honestly, word of mouth has been the best sort of advertisement ever. I mean, that's another thing that's just timeless. And you know, I never did get to go on that show because the podcast is no more. But that's what started us doing our podcast, and you know, just talking about it and sharing it with our kids the way that I do, you know, because our dad shared it with us. We wouldn't be fans if our dad hadn't shared it with us, you know. So I echo everything everybody said, but I mean, talking about it is huge, you know, and podcast the way that we do and promoting the crap out of it, and you know, and just having fun, because Dark Shadows is fun, you know.
Agree. It should be about having fun, and that's a big motto I have just internally when I go into the podcast. This is fun. I'm having fun talking about this stuff, you know? That's what it's about. Absolutely. All right, Alan, ways to sort of keep Dark Shadows alive in the zeitgeist and the pop culture. Any thoughts on that?
Well, I'll tell you one of the localized things that I do is rather eccentric, but kind of fun. I teach oral comm, intro to oral comm at Seminole State here in Florida. And basically, when it comes time for us to talk about topic selection, we discuss things like brainstorming and topic maps and things like that in order to create a topic, a generalized topic, and then break it down into smaller parts of the topic. That's when they get a history lesson on Dark Shadows.
Awesome.
And by this time, they already know that I'm kind of, you know, I'm out there a little bit in class because I'm trying to also get them relaxed enough to deal with their anxiety in a way that says, oh, this is a safe place to be a little bit anxious about doing a speech, because people typically are anxious about doing their speech assignments. So I say, okay, here's my topic, Dark Shadows. You know what that is? No. Okay. And I go on, and I talk about its relationship to Gothic literature. I talk about its relationship. You can do a speech on that, or you can do a speech on its relationship to 19th century melodrama. Here, let's do a speech about how it broke ground for its time, mid-century, mid-20th century. Let's talk about its technological advances. Let's talk about how it used classic literature tropes, and so on, and just break it up into little bubbles all around the main topic. So I do that for my classes, and they either think I'm completely nuts, or they say, where can I see this show? And I say,
oh, great. You know, if you just get one that's intrigued, that's enough. Yep.
Yeah. So I do that. But in terms of what we do, again, I think being kind to each other, as you said, Patrick, is really important, and taking that kindness out into the world of people that go, what the hell is that? And sort of kind of rounding those edges off a little bit. And I know people from 16 years old all the way up to about 85 years old that I've discussed the show with in one way or another, because of a side a parallel interest. Let's put it that way, a parallel interest, either in that type of literature, the type of movies, whatever it happens to be. And I'll also tell people about, hey, I got this cool collection. You know what it's about? Because some people I know are collectors and maybe they haven't seen the show. So, but here's why I collect this stuff, because you can watch this and see that. So it's just all about sort of spreading it.
Yeah.
Just spreading it.
Spreading. Okay, great. Patrick, rounding back to you.
Sure. A couple of things. One, it's okay to be tired of dark shadows. And by that, I mean that, when the original writers and producers were nearing the end of the show, it's no secret that they kind of out of gas in a little ways, and that's okay. They did their bit for it, and maybe with a little bit of rest, they would have been able to come back and do a few more bits. My God, the heroic efforts of MPI. There's no reason we should still be talking about this show. There's no reason who's talking about Secret Storm? Nobody, except in the context of Dark Shadows. It's a thing where MPI did so much for it. But I think as the actors aged and as they retired or as they passed away, it can be very difficult, if that is your framework for Dark Shadows, to hold on to it. And with media no longer a thing that you can really package and sell in a specific way with a specific voice, that becomes very difficult. You have to redefine what you're doing. The person that's not in this, who I think is the kind of phantom limb of all of this, is Wallace McBride, who, as much as anyone, is responsible for certainly why I'm here. And when 2012 rolled around, he was articulating Dark Shadows with the most powerful media force that's existed in God knows how long, if ever, meaning the democratization of media through the internet. He articulated what was fun and cool and interesting and sometimes ironic, but sometimes very serious about Dark Shadows with a modern voice for modern people. And that's great. What I think needs to be done to keep Dark Shadows going is exactly what the people here are doing. They're articulating their passion. As Jule would say, they're shining a light on Dark Shadows, and they are keeping it alive in the framework that we are alive for, that we are fresh for. Write your books, write your Dark Shadows Day book, publish it. Get those things out there, keep the discussion going, keep it active in the zeitgeist. That's up to you, and that's up to us, because right now, and God willing, Mr. Perry will change this, but right now it's us, it's fans, it can be fan fiction, it can be analysis, it can be any of those things. In a lot of ways, Dark Shadows is more active and has been more active as a topic of discussion that is something that people can reach all over the world than maybe it's ever been. And that's because people decide that, like Jule, just, let's use this webcam and get onto YouTube and put something out there, keep the discussion out there. And that, I think, is a really beautiful thing. Right now, Dark Shadows is in a very grassroots place.
Yes, yeah.
And that what we're doing is, I think, a marvelous thing, and it's open for everyone to take some ownership and put it out there.
Excellent. I mean, that's a great call to action, I think, because if you're listening to this and you have some desire or creative skill that you can apply to the Dark Shadows world, make it happen, do it, don't be afraid to take the bull by the horns and jump in and do your thing, make your thing, create your thing and put it out there. There are a lot of Facebook groups I see for Dark Shadows where people posting fan art and photos and their discussions and thoughts. And I love that. I think, but we need to see more of that, I think. And just put it out there, do a podcast. If you want to do a Dark Shadows podcast, if you've been thinking about it, go for it, do it. You want to make a Dark Shadows fan film. I know that's kind of discouraged, I think, by the powers that be sometimes, but You know, I mean, I don't see, there are a lot of Star Trek fan films. I mean, why not do a Dark
Right.
Shadows one? It's wide open to sort of express yourself, but also put it out there that Dark Shadows is here. It's a thing. And I do worry about it fading away. I also worry a little bit about the soap opera stigma. Like a couple of people called out the Secret Storm. Now, having been immersed in the horror community for a long time through doing Penny Dreadful, you know, when you say soap opera to a horror fan, sometimes they'll cringe. They'll be like, "What soap opera?" You know, they don't want. That's why I always say Dark Shadows is serial. It's
Yeah, well, it's
suspense
its origin,
serial, ongoing
its
suspense
origin, but yeah,
serial.
you're right, it's different. It is not.
It isn't, yeah.
Yeah,
isn't
I
like
usually
that.
I usually say it's serialized drama that uses soap opera tropes once in a while.
Yeah. At that structure. I mean, Dan Curtis was like, okay, you want to give me that? That's what you wanted me to use? Okay. And it works well because it ties into what they used to do with the Penny Dreadfuls, you know, is that ongoing serialized story with all these weird things going on. And as Alan pointed out, the melodrama, you know, the theatrical melodrama, that aspect going on. But I do find that, and it was advertised even originally as an ongoing, wasn't it an ongoing
Continuing
suspense?
suspense drama.
It's a continuing suspense drama.
That was the
Yes.
original.
I do horror
Curtis
cons.
didn't want, after a while, Curtis didn't want it referred to as a soap opera anymore.
Curtis himself, yeah.
Yes.
I mean, it's so different from, you know, like I've said before on the podcast, I watched All My Children for a little while with my mom because I wanted to see Louis Edmonds. I wanted to see Louis Edmonds. He was
Sure.
Langley Wallingford, you know, but I could tell. I mean, it was like, this is not the same as Dark Shadows. It's a very different. The content was very different. So I do worry sometimes that's why Dark Shadows gets kind of ignored. I don't know if that's it feels like sometimes Dark Shadows gets ignored in the pop culture world sometimes, and I don't like that. Like, unlike things like the Twilight Zone or Star Trek or Doctor Who or the Planet of the Apes, they always seem to get their props. But Dark Shadows, it's like every once in a while you'll see Dark Shadows get a nod, but it's very rare, and I'm not sure why that is. Anybody
It's
have
large. It's big.
It's big. Yeah.
It's big. Even with the advantages that it has of being a continuing serial, which nowadays is now familiar to most television and cable audiences, it's huge. Which is, one of the problems we talk about is, if we got this new enthusiast, we don't want to turn them off. So where do we start them?
Yeah.
Where do we start them in the show? So, and it might be different with different people too. You have to kind of.
It's episode 700.
Well, 700 is where I
yes,
love.
yeah, yep, 1897.
But beyond that, you're very right about something. When we were getting into Dark Shadows, most of us, it might have been around the time of the videotapes or World Vision, or even when it was on Sci-Fi, and there was really no expectation that you're going to see all of it. You're going to catch parts of it here and there and kind of put it together, almost like Dr. Lang. And now that it is all available, 1 through 1,225, 245, there seems to be this assumption of, I need to watch all of it. I need to start it from the beginning. I need to. There's no need to. Watch it for a few weeks, love it, move on. If you want to come back to it, come back to it. It was meant to be not disposable entertainment, but certainly something that you could check in on when it was originally broadcast. Every few days. It was meant to be listened to while you're making a ham or something like that. Seriously, while you're doing your geometry homework or whatever. And the idea that it necessarily needs to be slavishly watched every single episode all the time is not necessarily the only way to access it. And I think giving people permission to just, pick something that looks weird, look at a thumbnail that looks like fun, and start there and watch it for a while, because it intrinsically will repeat all the information that you need. In a week or two, you'll be caught up.
Yeah, that's what my friend Ivan does, who gave me the Count Petofi picture. He jumped into the Barnabas, introduction to Barnabas. He watched that for a while. Then he jumped to 1795. He watched that for a while. Then he jumped to 1897. He watched that for a while. Then he went back and watched some of the Adam storyline. Like, he kind of jumped around and he dug it. He got into it, but it was just a different way of watching. He didn't watch it sequentially, like every single storyline in a row. He just kind of like, I'm going to watch this part of the story today, and he checked it out. And it's a fun, Yeah, it's a fun way to do it. You don't have to be overwhelmed by the idea of watching all 1,225 episodes. You can just dive on in, and any of those storylines are going to give you something fun to enjoy. But I do think it is daunting for people when they see, oh, it's all these episodes. Where do I start?
If you're going to start a Dark Shadows podcast, just do it. Don't worry about the pressures of doing it. Talk about the product you love and have fun and shine a positive light on the product you love. I gotta go, guys. Thank you so
All
much,
right,
Penny,
Jule, thank you so
for
much.
having me, and guys
Thank
have
you
a
for
great
being
night.
had.
Thank you. Have a great night.
I do want to touch on what Joel said. I mean, yes, absolutely. If you want to talk about Dark Shadows, it's not hard, get yourself a program and do it, or like Joel, you have the video or whatever. But I think the biggest thing, or one of the most important things rather, is, Penny Dreadful has a podcast, and Alan has a podcast, and Joel has a podcast, and we have a podcast. I think it's so important that we are all fans of each other, that we support each other in this endeavor, because we all want the same thing. We're all fans of the same thing. And I think it's so important to, like the gatekeeping thing, not put each other down, to be positive. There it is again, be positive, be kind,
Yeah.
but to be fans of each other, promote each other, and I don't know. I love listening to all of you guys. So I mean, it gives me joy. So
Yeah, likewise, 100%. One thing I've heard come up too is that things that are discussed on shows like this are old hat, because it's all been talked about before, because Dark Shadows is almost 60 years old. And I understand the sort of motivation for thinking that way, but I disagree with that, because everybody comes to it with a different opinion, a different perspective, a different way of looking at the show. I just did an episode with Vikram Mather, who talked about, cross-cultural appeal, and he grew up in Indian culture and why Dark Shadows appealed to him and his family. And I had never heard that perspective before from an Indian American fan. I thought that was really cool. There are always new things that we can hear about, and maybe some of the cast and crew members who we don't hear about from that often, maybe they'll be willing to come on and talk too. I would love to hear from some of them too. There are always new things to hear about and discover in different perspectives, that I think makes Dark Shadows fascinating. To me, it's never old hat or been there, done that. There are always new ways to look at it.
Yeah, Shakespeare died 406 years ago, right?
There you
Somewhere
go.
around there.
Yeah.
And we're still talking about him.
Yeah.
yeah.
And think about the biggest film franchise of the past 20 years was based on something that was 50 years old, the Marvel Universe.
Yeah.
And yet look at what was done with that in the very best sense. Great storytelling is part of the fabric of who we are as humans. And Dark Shadows is great storytelling, and we cannot back away from that central premise. And that's what brings us to it, and that's what makes us feel alive about it, and that's what keeps Dark Shadows alive. Shakespeare's great storytelling too.
Yeah.
It's no Dark Shadows, but he was okay.
He did all right for a guy who's also
I-
borrowing.
Yeah. And as Patrick has written these Dark Shadows daybooks, he examines Dark Shadows from really interesting angles and looks at it. And that's another way to keep Dark Shadows relevant. Writing, if you can write a book about Dark Shadows, like Patrick has.
Yeah, I was actually fortunate because last year, a friend of mine runs DePaul's Pop Culture Celebrations, and last year was all about time travel. So I had proposed, wrote, and presented a paper about Dark Shadows, time travel, and transgenerational trauma.
Oh, nice.
You can actually order the book via Amazon. So, because it's a collection of papers from the seminar. So, yeah, for those who are watching, you don't have to limit it to just like either nonfiction or fiction. If you're an academic and you want to look at the show through that lens, do it.
Yeah,
There's
sure.
another person by the name of Benshoff, I think, that published an academic paper on
Yes.
Dark. There it is. That's it. Harry
There it
Benshoff.
is.
Yeah.
Look at that.
Yeah, people have written all these great academic, articles on Dark Shadows for literary journals or for their dissertations and stuff. I want to close things out here. I am so grateful to my guests. Please do check out all of their shows: Alan Gallant, Collinsport After Dark, Cara, Tillitz, and Christen Pierce, Between the Shadows, Patrick McCray, Gordon Dymowski, and Jule T. Saynes, resident of Collinwood. Please check out their shows, all wonderful shows, and keeping the dark shadows, the flames, the blue candles burning at the old house. I highly encourage you to check out, put links to all their shows, of course, in the notes. And with that said, I really appreciate all of the listeners for my podcast and for all of these podcasts. I look at the YouTube comments, and it's so heartening to see people enjoying and being enthusiastic and chiming in with their own thoughts. So please continue to do that. It's all about celebrating Dark Shadows. It really is, because we're not making money doing this. This is not
Well,
about
Danielle,
Yeah.
thank you. Thank
Yes.
you
Absolutely.
for what you're doing.
Oh, you said, I'm doing what you guys are doing. We're having a good time. We're having fun.
Yeah, but you've given us all huge boosts, so
You
I
do it really well.
appreciate that.
Oh,
Really appreciate
thank
that.
you. Thank you. You're very kind. All right, guys. Thank you. I'm just going to hit stop.
Terror at Collinwood is a Penny Dreadful production.